In the winter of 1894, a visitor in the Arizona desert reportedly heard an elderly Hopi man describe a place neither of them could see thousands of years ago. Far to the north, beside a great body of water, people had once opened the earth and removed copper. They were not his people. They came from across the water, worked the mines, carried the metal away, and disappeared. All they left behind were wounds in the ground. The story should have sounded impossible. The wounds were real. American miners had already found them beneath the forests of Lake Superior. The question was not whether the ancient mines existed. It was how a man nearly 1,500 miles away could have known about them. During the 19th century, reports of copper drew prospectors into the forests of northern Michigan. They believed they were entering untouched mineral country. Then they began finding pits. At first, the depressions did not look unusual. Roots crossed them, fallen leaves filled them, trees had grown inside them. But the pits followed the richest copper-bearing ridges. They ran across hillsides in deliberate lines. And when modern crews cleared them, they repeatedly found copper underneath. Someone had reached the deposits first. The ancient workers had followed veins through volcanic rock and opened trenches above exposed metal. In some places, the easiest way for a modern company to find copper was simply to continue digging where the ancient miners had stopped. The prospectors believed they were discovering one of America's greatest copper regions. They were actually reopening it. Then the tools appeared. Heavy stone hammers lay inside the workings. Many had grooves around their centers where wooden handles or bindings could be attached. Some could be swung with one hand. Others were massive. Broken hammerstones remained where they had failed. There were no iron picks, no steel drills, no explosives. Only stone, wood, fire, water, and evidence of labor repeated across generations. The 19th century miners had machinery, metal tools, and industrial capital. The people who reached the copper first had none of those things. Yet they had found the same veins. That should not have been possible, it was. The reason was hidden inside the geology of Lake Superior. In most parts of the world, copper is trapped inside ore. The rock must be crushed and heated before the usable metal can be separated. That requires furnaces, fuel, controlled temperatures, and knowledge of smelting. Lake Superior was different. Ancient volcanic activity had created deposits where copper existed as native metal. It could appear as nearly pure copper inside the rock. Some pieces could be collected from the surface. Others formed veins and enormous masses underground. The metal did not need to be smelted before it could be worked. It was already copper. Removing it was still punishing. Miners struck the rock with hammerstones. They may have heated exposed surfaces with fire and cooled them so the stone cracked. Wood had to be cut. Water had to be carried. Broken rock had to be lifted from the pits. Then the copper had to be shaped, could become spear points, knives, fish hooks, awls, beads, and ornaments. But repeated hammering hardened the metal. If the worker continued too long, it could crack. The copper had to be heated, softened, and returned to the hammer. The miners understood the material. They knew where to find it. They knew how to remove it, and they knew how to shape it without destroying it. That knowledge had to survive from one generation to the next. One discovery showed just how ambitious the work could become. Later miners uncovered a huge mass of copper that ancient workers had already separated from much of the surrounding rock. They had raised it onto a wooden support and apparently prepared it for further cutting. Then the work stopped. The copper remained in place. Parts of the supporting timber were reportedly still beneath it when the site was uncovered. No one knows why it was abandoned. Perhaps the mass was too difficult to divide. Perhaps the season ended. Perhaps the support failed. Perhaps the workers intended to return. The unfinished site preserved an ancient mining operation in the middle of a task. These were not people casually gathering loose copper from the ground. They were trying to move masses of solid metal, and the work was not limited to the mainland. Ancient pits stretched across the Keweenaw Peninsula and onto Isle Royale, an island surrounded by the cold waters of Lake Superior. Reaching the island required more than mining skill. People needed canoes, food, tools, knowledge of the lake, and enough good weather to cross safely. Lake Superior can become dangerous quickly. Its water is cold. Storms arrive without much warning. Even modern boats can struggle there. Ancient expeditions had to choose the right season, carry supplies to the island, locate known deposits, extract the copper, and transport it back across the lake. Someone knew the route, remembered where the productive veins were, and understood when the crossing could be made. But the boats decayed, the camps disappeared. The miners left no written explanation of how the work was organized. Only the pits remained. And when researchers began dating what survived inside them, the story moved much deeper into the past. Copper working in the Great Lakes region began thousands of years ago. Some evidence places mining in the Keweenaw region as early as roughly 8,000 years ago, with activity on Isle Royale beginning later. People were returning to these deposits long before Rome existed. For generation after generation, they crossed the lake, opened the earth, and carried copper away. Then their names disappeared, but their work did not, and neither apparently did every memory of what they had done. If stories like this are why you are here, subscribe. Because the pits explain how the copper was removed. They do not explain how knowledge of the mines reached Arizona. And that brings us back to the Hopi elder. How did a man living nearly 1,500 miles away know a story about ancient mines in Michigan? The answer may lie in what happened after the copper left Lake Superior. Artifacts made from Great Lakes, copper have been found across large parts of North America. The metal reached the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, the Atlantic coast, and regions far beyond the mines. It moved through the same broad systems of exchange that carried coastal shells, inland, and obsidian, far from the places where it formed. No single miner had to travel from Lake Superior to Arizona. The copper could pass from one community to another, carrying some knowledge of where it had come from. That makes the Hopi account possible. It does not make every detail certain. The story was recorded thousands of years after the earliest mines were opened. Languages had changed. Names had disappeared. Places, people, and events may have merged as the account passed between generations. Even the phrase, "people from across the water," is unclear. It may describe people crossing Lake Superior. It may refer to another body of water, or it may reflect the way the 19th century visitor interpreted what he heard. The account cannot identify the miners. The ground can take us further. The tools, settlements, artifacts, and dates place the mines inside the indigenous world of the Great Lakes. Archaeologists call this long tradition the Old Copper Complex. It was not one copper empire. It stretched across thousands of years and was probably practiced by different communities at different times. The earliest miners lived too long ago to connect securely to one modern tribe. Their names are gone, but knowledge of the copper country survived. when French priests, traders, and explorers entered the Lake Superior region. During the 17th century, they learned about its copper from the Ojibwe. For Ojibwe communities, copper was not merely useful, it also carried spiritual and medicinal importance. They knew where it could be found and preserved traditions surrounding its power, even though they did not necessarily claim that their ancestors had opened the earliest pits. That is as close as the evidence allows us to come. The Hopi account may preserve a distant memory of the mining world. The Ojibwe preserved a continuing relationship with the copper country itself, and archaeology identifies the ancient tradition behind the mines. But none of those sources can tell us how that world was organized. That mystery remains in the pits. So what can we prove? Ancient indigenous communities mined native copper around Lake Superior. They opened pits across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. They worked with stone tools, timber, fire, and water. They crossed dangerous stretches of lake to reach offshore deposits. They shaped copper into tools, weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. And some of that metal moved far beyond the region where it was mined. Those facts are no longer in serious doubt. What is likely? The pits were probably not created by one enormous workforce or one centralized mining empire. They accumulated over thousands of years. Different communities may have returned during different periods. Some work may have been seasonal. Knowledge of particular deposits may have belonged to families, specialists, or local groups whose relationships are no longer visible. The mining was extensive, but its scale grew across generations. It did not need a lost industrial civilization to explain it. What has been exaggerated? Early writers tried to calculate how much copper had been removed from the ancient workings. Some estimates reached hundreds of millions of pounds. Others climbed higher. Those figures created the idea of an enormous quantity of missing copper. But the estimates were not based on measuring every pit. Researchers measured a limited number of workings, made assumptions about their depth, and multiplied those assumptions across thousands of sites. A small error repeated often enough becomes an extraordinary number. That does not mean little copper was removed. It means the total cannot be calculated with confidence. And there is no reason every piece should still exist as a recognizable artifact. Copper could be reshaped repeatedly. A damaged tool could become an ornament. An ornament could become another tool. Objects could be buried, lost, traded, recovered, or removed during later mining. The copper did not need one final destination. It had thousands. What remains genuinely unknown is not where every pound went. It is the human system surrounding the mines, who organized the crossings to Isle Royale, who controlled access to the richest deposits. And what did copper mean to the people who carried it far from the lake? Archaeology can recover a hammerstone. It can date charcoal. It can test the composition of a copper artifact, but it cannot easily recover the relationships surrounding those objects, cannot tell us who taught the route across the lake. It cannot show what obligation was created when copper passed between communities. It cannot recover every belief attached to opening the earth. That is where oral tradition matters, not because it gives us a perfect transcript of the past. It does not. But because it may preserve details the ground cannot, a northern lake. People removing copper, scars left behind. The strange story was partly true. The lake was real, the mines were real, the copper was real, and the abandoned pits remained beneath the forest. What we cannot prove is exactly who the Hopi story remembered. how old that memory was, or how much it changed before someone wrote it down. Archaeology did not prove the legend, but the legend may have preserved the shape of something real.